Let's begin.
Burn, ungodly filth!
What do you want? To make you ours or to make you despair?
Spirit Blade Productions presents...
Do you have any idea how much I will make you suffer? The horrific agony that I will inflict.
Spirit Blade, Dark Ritual.
Hell will be a refuge for you when I'm finished. For more information, visit spiritblade.com.
I do not understand what I do, but for what I want I do, Chesed, son of Shalumia, Ahiez, or Pedaz, or... That really means something, doesn't it? Okay, so let's look at 9 through 22 then, of chapter 2. In the ESV, that reads, "Then you will understand righteousness, and justice, and equity, every good path. For wisdom will come into your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will watch over you. Understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech, who forsake the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perverseness of evil, men whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, and her paths to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it." Okay, so a lot in that stretch. What jumps out to you?
Well, the first thing that I want to mention, this is verses 16 through 18 and 19 are often passages that people will look to and they'll say, "Oh, look, see how anti-woman God is."
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But it's important to remember the number one, the who this was written to,
Yeah.
and then who the audience was. Okay, it was a very patriarchal society. However, Solomon was writing directly to his son, which is why he uses an adulteress as an example of sin. If he had been writing to a daughter, his illustration would have been more of a man that commits sin.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to pull that out and say we're not equating women with sin. We're nothing like that. And I think Jesus affirms that later on when you look through the passages and just see how many times women were used in fact, I would say, before Christ ascends into heaven, women were used more in his ministry sometimes than his disciples were.
Yeah.
They were the first ones who saw that he was risen from the dead.
Yeah.
So that's pretty important, and it's pretty, that shows that Jesus said, "You know what, guys, you got it wrong," with the way you set things up in order. So I just want to say that it's just as a way of illustration, and nobody is saying that that women are evil, and he is also speaking specifically of an adulteress, so a woman who is outside the will of God, who is, whose job it is to commit sin, and these warnings against staying away from people who walk in sin. Most people, if they're around people that are sinning, most people are not going to be able to avoid that sin if those are the only people you're around. We're not talking about going out and witnessing. We're not talking about, but if you are constantly around and you constantly place yourself in situations where you're going to be tempted to sin, you're eventually going to be influenced by those people. And that's really what he's talking about. Avoid that path, avoid those people. And talking about, being cut off from God. We don't want to be cut off from God. And that's hard to think of. If you think about it, that's why Jesus said, if your hand offends you, cut it off. Mm-hmm. This is a great example. If there's somebody around you that is causing you to stumble, you need to cut yourself off from that person until you get to a place in your life where you can go back and minister to that person. And we'll see this a lot more. I wonder if while Solomon was writing this, because he keeps coming back to the adulteress repeatedly through the book of Proverbs, and I wonder if he saw something in Rehoboam's life and said, I'm seeing something in you, son, and I need, you need to be careful, avoid this. Because we're going to see this repeatedly throughout Proverbs, where he comes back to the same illustration over and over again, and often, just like any other parent, you're going to repeat yourself over and over to your children when you recognize a pattern of sin in their life that's going to lead them to destruction. And so you're going to repeatedly warn them and remind them to stay away from that.
Yeah, and I think it's worth coming back to the topic of sexuality. I might be repeating myself. I feel like I've said this somewhere, so forgive me if I'm saying this again. But I think for a time I felt like I got to be careful because people can get the impression that the only thing that Christians care about is sex, and it's all sex is bad, and we got to. And there's this overemphasis on sexual issues, and so I think, in wanting to avoid that overemphasis, there have been times where maybe I've gone too far and steered away from really emphasizing what the Bible itself emphasizes. We don't want to overemphasize it, but let's recognize that the sexual drive, especially in men, is this very powerful thing, and especially so assuming that the original initial audience here is someone that is perhaps entering into or already into the most sexually driven time, of their lives. And so, we don't want to, sexual temptation is it's a reality. It's an ongoing, long-term reality. Maybe, your hormones settle down a bit, but that doesn't get you out of the woods. This is a really an intense and real thing, So yeah, and I think there's some indications of just the fallout from sexual sin that the author wants to keep his son from experiencing, in verses 16 through 20. Just the being unfaithful in our marriages can cause this destruction, this self-destruction, this loss of life as it's meant to be experienced, and so that really stood out to me. Let's see here. Verse 9 was interesting, just backing up a little bit, that what I kind of observed from that is that wisdom brings understanding about what is actually right and just and fair. So I think that we can get a better understanding about life and when we've really been wronged compared to, those situations where we're like, maybe there's another side of this I'm not considering. We get a better understanding of fairness, and of what is right and what is just. And so that, I think, can help us deal with some situations where, that we don't have control over. I think it can also help make us better influencers and leaders, whether that's, in church, in a social setting, in work. If we have influence or maybe actually responsibility to lead in some way, I think that having this better understanding of what is really right, what is really just, and what is really fair can help us navigate some of those bumpy situations where there's disagreement or hurt feelings or whatever, and help us kind of bring healing, and understanding to those situations.
Yeah. Just to jump back to the whole idea of, why is sexual sin talked about so much in the Bible?
Yeah.
I was thinking about this the other day. I was in my men's Bible study group, and we were, farther along in Proverbs, and sexual sin came up again in the book of Proverbs, like it's wont to do. And I was thinking about it, and sexual sin is what I call the trifecta of sin, because you're sinning against yourself, you're sinning against someone else, and you're sinning against God.
Yeah.
Normally when most sins, it's you might sin against your body, but most sins we don't sin against our body. And maybe there's a sin against. I mean, it's always sin against God, and maybe something that you're doing, you're sinning against someone else. So if you lie, that's a sin against someone else and God, but it's not really a sin against yourself. But sexual sin it's a sin against your body, someone else's body, and then also against God. And so that's why I think it's so important. I think it does often get overemphasized, especially when you can go through the Bible and find lots of lists of sins, and the guy, oftentimes in a church, the person behind the pulpit, they're not preaching about gluttony, are they? If they're overweight,
Oh man, yeah.
Christians statistically are very overweight compared to the rest of the country. Yeah, I was looking at numbers one time, and so we need to think about that. We really need to think about that and consider that. Nobody's talking about there are some churches that are talking about the refugee crisis here, and what's happening at the border, and actually looking at it from a Christian angle. But a study has shown that white evangelicals are the least likely to support allowing refugees into the country. And that is a sad state. And pastors aren't getting up and talking about that behind the pulpit and saying,
refugees.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's tough. It's really tough, and there's a lot of things. Sin kind of jumps out. I think we've kind of jumped on this sexual sin kind of jumps out, and I think we've jumped on it probably a little bit too much, because we've had Roe v. Wade, we've had these deals with abortion, and we've had no-fault divorce. We've had all these things that have kind of built up. But the funny thing is like back in the 60s, the Southern Baptist Convention, they were not opposed to abortion.
Oh.
When it was politically convenient, that's when they started opposing it.
Interesting.
And so, we really need to examine when we are talking about sexual sin, to make sure that we're not, we're not doing it to try and, number one, guilt people, or to gain something out of it. Right? The idea should be, we want to point you to Christ and how your sex life should glorify God, instead of glorify yourself.
Yeah. And as the teacher in Proverbs, emphasizes, it's also for our own good to approach life the way God intended it. When I see verses 11 through 15, your discretion will watch over, understanding will guard you, delivering you from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech. So wisdom protects us from those who would try to manipulate us and take advantage of us.
Right.
And then I think that, even though there's some discussion about the land and stuff at the end here, I want to bring out maybe a parallel. In verses 21 and 22, we've got, for the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it, but the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. So the context of these Proverbs is that they were given, first to an individual person, but they're also recorded for the nation of Israel,
Right.
whom God promised a special land to. And although God will ultimately fulfill this promise through the physical earthly reign of Jesus, the promise to the land, the promise of the land to Israel hasn't ever been completely fulfilled,
Right.
because Israel has been disobedient and derailed their progress toward what God has for them. The parallel, I think, for us is that pursuing wisdom keeps us on track toward the ways in which God wants to bless us.
Yeah, definitely.
While our foolishness derails us from the ways that God wants to bless us, as we suffer the consequences, just like Israel did. They have not been able yet to experience the full, very tangible blessing that God has wanted to give to them. And the same principle, I think, applies to us when we abandon wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely.